Chapter 1. Processed foods replaced the need for a proper home-cooked meal, and TV played a huge role. Home-cooked meals are the norm in society, but recently there has been an influx in more refined foods that have taken the food industry by storm. The quality a meal possesses, which makes it appealing and delicious, is down to many factors: sweet, sour, spicy, and a lot of sensations identifiable by the taste buds. Research has shown that the most prominent taste is that of sweetness. We taste sweetness more than any other flavor, which is why we are predisposed to craving sweet dishes and snacks. Our sweet tooth isn't a tooth, it's our tongue, some parts of the palate on the roof of the mouth, and even some parts of the stomach. While this revelation seems new, it is a known fact to significant companies dealing in easy foods or processed foods. Don't underestimate the amount of sugar in whatever you eat. There might be hidden amounts lurking. Armed with this knowledge, the companies produce loads of products containing a chunk of the additives for the unsuspecting masses. In the 1950s, the TV had just made its debut, and more women were getting jobs that gave them less time to be at home and cook meals for their families. It was a lucky stroke helped along by excellent marketing. It mattered little. The customer base grew and grew tremendously with the catchy commercials and the products tailored to trigger our sweet tooth. These new prospects, tremendous and convenient as they were not good enough to replace home-cooked meals, not because they weren't viable, but because home economics teachers kept teaching kids growing up how to make these meals. Regardless of how much time it'll take to prepare them, we are advised to always go for the option of a home-cooked meal. There was no discrepancy on processed foods, since kids could as well make their meals. The fix for this was to enlist home economics to endorse these processed meals as much better options. It got instant success, garnering enough support to oust home-cooked meals, thanks to the presence of sugar, fat, and salt. This is just a short history lesson. In the remaining chapters, we will dive more into the food industry, see its tactics, and how you can prevent yourself from consuming unhealthy food. Chapter 2. The presence of sugar in processed foods is no mystery. When humanity was fresh off evolving and rose to the top of the food chain, we craved sugary foods. Lots of them. Not necessarily sweet foods, but foods that contained the sugars that were converted into energy. Fruits and starchy foods possess many sugars and help us with enough power to escape or fight off predators. It is no longer sustainable to consume unhealthy foods high in sugar, as it can lead to severe health conditions. We may have an insatiable hunger for sugar, but we have a limit, a pre-programmed upper limit for when we've had too much sugar. So, even though we can't help ourselves, we literally cannot have too much. Guess who knows this convenient piece of information? The processed food companies, of course. We must learn to control our urge to consume sugary foods to avoid contracting health complications. Not all these companies consider this limit we have for sugars. In fact, they choose to ignore it and go for the overload option. Most people don't know that these processed foods and drinks flood our bodies with unhealthy amounts of sugar so that we need or crave even more. The average American consumes around 22 teaspoons of sugar every day, and of that number, more than 70% comes solely from processed foods. We consume these products without considering our well-being because it tastes good and inadvertently ruins our bodies. But this is for the products that come labeled to contain sugar or additives. There exists products that don't even need sugars but have them anyway. This means even if you avoid the obvious processed foods or drinks with sugar, your bowl of pasta might contain even more sugar. No matter how tasty processed meals are, it is pertinent that we avoid them like the plague. Even in pasta sauce, after tomatoes, the main ingredient is sugar. These odd combinations are wrong and immoral. sugar has no place in specific meal options. If sugar is the methamphetamine of processed food ingredients, with its high-speed, blunt assault on our brains, then fat is the opiate, a smooth operator whose effects are less obvious but no less powerful. Michael Moss. Did you know? The average tomato paste contains at least 12 grams of sugar. That's about 6 cubes of sugar. Chapter 3. People continue to consume unhealthy meals amidst concerns. In the 70s, it became increasingly apparent that the continued consumption of sugars and processed foods were extraordinarily harmful and ultimately detrimental to the quality of life. Still, people ignored all these clear red flags and stocked up on more of the same foods. Increased indulgence in the sweet foods led to a worrying increase in the cases of tooth decay in children. Further investigation showed an even more worrisome trend set into motion by the most powerful tool of advertisement in the 70s, the television. It turns out kids were affected by the hidden sugars. They watched commercials on TV that sold them on several breakfast options of cereal. Research later showed that these cereals contain insane amounts of sugar, which caused widespread tooth decay in children. But this isn't the only health-related illness of sugar consumption. There is, and remains, a significant risk of diabetes from these meals and snacks. While the children battled with tooth decay, the adults had to contend with life-threatening complications from diabetes. For much of the 1970s, Americans were plagued with staggering cases of health troubles directly linked to sales of processed foods and quick meals. It would help if you didn't believe everything you see on TV. The foods may look good, but they are ultimately destructive for you. Surprisingly enough, these concerns and studies didn't deter the sales, nor the demand for that matter. Even though people knew these meals were unhealthy and were the leading cause of most, if not all, the life-threatening conditions that were plaguing them, they still purchased more of the well-packaged poisons. You would be better off if you learned to wean yourself off the dependency of sugar and sugary meals to avoid damaging your health. In the 80s, there was a spike in the publicized dangers of purchasing and consuming processed food instead of a dip in sales. With a recorded increase in profits for companies such as Coca-Cola for a couple of decades, it was not surprising that by the end of the millennia in 1999, there was a substantial presence of obesity in the average American, accompanied by diabetes and heart disease. Thus, the sweetened breakfast was born, as was a core industry strategy that food processors would deploy forever. Just swap out the problem component for another that wasn't at the moment as high on the list of concerns. Michael Moss. Chapter 4. As deadly as the presence of sugar in the foods we eat, it doesn't compare to the effects of fat. The first horseman in the army of the food industry is sugar. Quite impressive and powerful, but it doesn't even come close to the firepower of fat. We are hardwired to crave sugar and whatever tastes like it. Processed food companies know this, and as such, they overload the products with so much sugar and enjoy a lot of success doing so. But here's the thing. With sugar, you need a lot of it to cause enough damage, but the amount of sugar present in these processed meals only had half the amount of the calories that fat would have in its place. This meant that, gram for gram, fat had 2 times the amount of calories sugar would. That's a lot of calories, considering we can't taste or tell when fat is too much. While we are on the lookout for sugar in our meals, we must keep a watchful eye out for the presence of fat as well. Since we can both taste sugar and have a pre-programmed upper satisfaction limit for it, there's at least some kind of check put in place by nature. But with fat, there's none of that, not even a little. We can't taste it when it's alongside sugar or tell when it's in excess. This glitch meant that these processed food companies could put a ridiculous amount of it into the foods and we'd not even notice it. That explains, of course, why the average American exceeds their daily limit of fat by a whopping 50% and is unsurprisingly overweight. Sugar and fat work hand in hand to deliver the consumer with potential health risks in tasty snacks. Fat makes the processed foods last longer on the shelf, meaning you'd have more than enough time to eventually purchase them, while the sugar makes it pleasurable to eat more and more of the unhealthy cuisine. These processed foods contain a huge amount of fat that aids their shelf life, but this makes them bad for your heart. Opt for fresh foods instead. The dangers of this massive amount of fat and the associated calories almost go without saying. But there is a straight line from heart diseases and type 2 diabetes for note. There are only so little calories the body can expel when you aren't exercising or engaging in physical activity. Chapter 5. There are a ton of foods we consume daily that are supposed to be healthy but aren't. We know the food classes and what nutrients they give us and in what amounts, so surely we know what to eat and what not to eat. So how come we eat healthily but still add excess weight and turn out like those who indulge in unhealthy meals? Two foods have been at the helm of this debacle: milk and cheese. The thing is, cheese is quite fatty in its original production recipe, but then when it's processed cheese, it contains more fat. The calories in cheese are 2/3 of fat. How is cheese produced, though, and can it explain why it's so fatty? Thankfully, yes. The presence of fat spells doom for consumers. It's highly present in cheese, so you're advised to learn to do without it. In the 1950s, the demand for milk grew, drawing to the government's notice the need to make it more affordable. So they subsidized the cost of production for the farmers so that the sales would move on smoothly. Everybody's happy. With the influx of milk, for fear of danger to health, the consumers demanded low-fat dairy, which wasn't a challenging task to accomplish. Only one problem: where will all the milk fat skimmed off go? Since the government was paying for the milk and whatever associated product it came with, the farmers had the idea to convert the excess milk fat into cheese and sell it to the consumers. This cheese contained so much saturated fat, all the fat the consumers sought to avoid in milk, and they gobbled it up in the increased consumption of cheese. With the increase in sugars in the meals, the government moved to regulate the amounts, causing the consumers to complain and demand things go back to normal. Still, with cheese, they sat back and kept funding the single most potent threat to the health of its citizens. The regulatory bodies try their best, but you must be willing to take responsibility for your well-being and self-regulate your intake of processed foods. And with the usual trend, the masses ate whatever it was without caring to check. Studies show the consumption of cheese had tripled since they started doing so in 1970. Chapter 6. With the apparent dangers of sugar and fat, it is easy to forget one crucial ingredient: salt, and its health implications. Maybe the lack of caloric content is to blame for underestimating salt's importance in our meals and diets. Unlike sugar and fat, it doesn't constitute enough mass to cause a breakup of cholesterol or unhealthy fat, but that doesn't mean it's entirely useless or harmless. It has an essential mineral for the human body: sodium. We need it for critical bodily functions. But an increase of sodium in the blood causes the blood to lose its thickness and move much quicker. This condition can deteriorate to a much worse condition known as hypertension. This data, of course, wasn't public knowledge, so salt consumption unknowingly increased, which led to more people suffering from hypertension. In the 80s, 1 in 4 Americans had the condition. The presence of sodium in our meals isn't a terrible idea, but we must learn to watch our salt intake to prevent hypertension. The numbers were a bit shaky, but studies zeroed the consumption to salt. Still, the average American eats around 10 to 20 times the normal amount per day. That's at least 10 times more than the body needs to function. This condition caused enough stir to make people take notice, and the government had to regulate the quantity of salt in whatever meals were sold to the populace. But the real culprit was the processed foods. They contained at least double the daily required safe amount of salt in the average canned or packaged processed food. Was this an intentional attempt to kill the consumers? Certainly not. Who would buy their products then? So why was there so much salt in these foods? One guess? They taste better with salt in them, so the more the merrier. But that's not the only reason. If it were, then there'd be no need for so much salt. The real reason is the same as that of excess fat: shelf life. Good as that sounds, it spells doom for the consumers who consume so much salt while the companies make big paychecks. The amount of salt in our meals is understated. We must avoid salt and salt-containing foods altogether. Conclusion: there's so much ease in simply throwing a preheated meal in the microwave and dinner comes out ready in a few minutes. Literal fast food. This promise was the allure processed foods had, but they came packed with more than just fancy ads or slogans. They wouldn't exactly sell on the efficacy of the commercials. They came loaded with 3 of the most potent ingredients known to man: sugar, salt, and fat. The awareness about the dangers were non-existent, so more and more people ate to their fill, only to discover it was making them obese and unhealthy. Studies have shown that a lot of what we consume contains so much of these 3 that we are in danger of taking in the required amount for at least 4 to 5 fully grown adults. Consumers are blissfully ignorant of the risks to which they expose themselves. Even when regulatory bodies tried to curtail the intake of these unhealthy products, ordering the companies to reduce the quantity of sugar, fat, and salt, the consumers rioted, demanding a return to the status quo. We have a glitch in our systems that explains this obvious kamikaze move. We are hardwired to desire large amounts of those 3 horsemen of the caloric apocalypse. Thankfully, there is more knowledge on these matters today, and we hope it is enough to wake up the minds of the consumers to take better care of their health. The notion that some foods behave like narcotics goes back at least 20 years in scientific circles. Michael Moss. Try this. We should look out for our well-being. The companies making profits from cramming our bodies with these unhealthy substances are looking out for themselves. We are advised to ensure that we live and eat healthy.